Before the war, Lincoln became president without campaigning in the South. This enrages the South since they thought that Lincoln was an abolitionist. This pushes them to the point where they decide to secede and turn into the Confederacy. Then the Confederacy threatens the North Fort Sumter. This fort, which is running out of supplies, gets word that the North will send supply ships unarmed and housing no troops to try to not enrage the South. This fails, and the South attacks Fort Sumter, starting the Civil War and forming the North into the Union.
In the beginning of the Civil War, each side thought they had an advantage over the other, with the Union having more people to fight, factories to produce, and more area covered with telegrams and railroads, and more resources. However, the Confederates had more military advantage. The Union will have to invade to conquer the Confederates, which was harder than defending. They also had more experienced generals on their side, but due to this dismay, it was proven wrong. The first battle of Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run, was supposed to be a quick victory for the Union by taking the Confederates' capital and by marching straight into the capital and seizing it. But as they marched to the capital, was stopped by the Confederates' army and clashed. The Union, losing their advantages after a while in the battle, was forced to retreat. This dashed the North's hope of early victory and gave the idea of a long war to the people.
In the beginning, each side had a strategy. The strategy of the North was to block all of the seaports that belonged to the South, the Navy blockade. They were initially trying to isolate them and block overseas sales of cotton. Also, the North wanted to take control of the Mississippi River to split the South in two, as well as take over the Confederates' capital, even though later on they failed to take over the capital. The South's strategy was to defend their own territory until the North got tired of fighting, and they sought help from the cotton buyers to aid them in the war. Even though the strategies were all planned out, the new technology proved to be effective in the war as both sides used the well-known mini-ball, lead balls that could do lethal damage, new rifles, which were loaded faster than traditional muskets, and cannons to the tactical advantage. Also, the ironclads were introduced, which are big warships with iron plating that makes it nearly indestructible to regular cannon fire. With this new technology, the war was harder to win because each side had access to the technology and tried to use it against them to gain the upper hand.
In the North, January 1st, 1863, Lincoln put a mass proclamation to weaken the South further. In order to weaken the South, they had freed their slaves from the Southerners' work, so they can stop helping the South economy. The South economy was production of the cotton, and the slaves produced the cotton. If the slaves stopped producing the cotton, then that would weaken the South proclamation, and ultimately weaken the South economy. Because of the proclamation, Britain decided to stop helping out the Confederates for the reason that they were trying to keep slavery. Also, since the proclamation freed the slaves, they decided to support the South and ultimately turn the war into a fight to end slavery.
During the war, divisions happened in the South, and some people tried to disrupt the war efforts. Some ways the South was divided by were states' rights and plantation owners. Places that had big plantations were mostly the places that had the most support for the war, contrasting the states with small plantations who didn't support the war that much. Also, states' rights were an ongoing issue with the South. States' rights was an issue because some states didn't want a government to control them and force them to give troops. Also, the South suffered from a huge inflation, bigger than the North's. The South's inflation cause was the Navy blockade, which Lincoln put in the beginning of the war. Because of these Navy blockades, the South couldn't make any money, leading to the inflation of prices over 80% of their original cost. Also, the North was destroying the South's way of making crops since they were always battling on South's farmlands. The war affected a lot of women since all of the men had to go fight in the war and the women had to take their place. The war created many new opportunities for women though. Some women became teachers and nurses, although nursing was not a proper job for respectable Southern women. Even though it wasn't proper, some volunteered anyways. It also affected people's minds and beliefs about the war. They thought that the war was a poor man's fight because both people had two ways of escaping fighting in the South. Two ways to escape were if a man had 20 enslaved people, he did not have to go to war, and they allowed draftees to hire substitutes to serve in their pay.
The idea behind the Battle of Gettysburg was that the South thought a victory on Union soil will force Northerners to end the war. The Confederate soldiers marched to the quiet town of Gettysburg, looking for shoes because of the short supply for the blockade of the Union. The Confederates encountered part of Meade's army. Shots were exchanged and more troops joined the army, both sides over time. The Confederates pushed back the Union into a hook-shaped hill surrounded by a field. They didn't have good trenches of fighting from the clear view of the fields. The Confederates attacked and lost because of the advantage that the Union had. This turns the war into the Union side, and while this is happening, they seceded Vicksburg. Since they could not take Vicksburg by force, they seceded it after about a month, bombarding and starvation. It's in Vicksburg. They gave up with many other Confederate strongholds. This event with the Gettysburg Battle turns into a major victory for the Union and ultimately leads to the surrender of the Confederacy.
The Civil War, after 4 long years, begins to end with General Lee's retreat and a final stand at Appomattox Courthouse, where he finally surrenders. After giving up to generous terms of freedom, they finally think about the terrible toll that the war has taken on America and start Reconstruction.